press that button, so I apologize. We are recording the event now, and it is on Facebook Live. There'll be a point where Christine shows some YouTube videos, and we'll stop recording at a time. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Christine.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to be sharing my screen here with the slide deck. So just give me one moment. All right. I'll kick it off to Vanessa to get us started, and then we'll keep going.
Awesome. Thanks, Christine. Thank you, Ryan. So like Christine said, my name is Vanessa Wallace. I am with Canadian Women in Sport on the programs team. I've been with the organization since August of 2019, and I'm having a great time. This is our Leading the Way webinar. It comes from a document that was produced several years ago by the same name, Leading the Way, and it's for the purpose of creating more inclusive spaces in sport for LGBTQ plus athletes. So you'll see the full acronym here that we use, which is LGBTQ I2S plus, but I don't want to steal the thunder from Christine. So if you want to hit to the next slide.
Yep. All right, so to kick us off, I think I'd definitely like to start with a territory acknowledgement, and I know that folks are chiming in from across likely the province or the country, and so I'm going to just quickly go over the acknowledgement of where I'm located, and we'll go from there. I would like to acknowledge the sacred land on which I am located on to co-host this virtual space. It's been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. The territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Pot Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, which is North America, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. For folks who may not be familiar with territory acknowledgements, this is something that I do as a person who does inclusion work. I do a lot of diversity and inclusion training, and so within that work, it is really important to always acknowledge the history that we are taking up space in, and also the fact that, you know, as somebody who is an immigrant settler, being that I immigrated here and I directly benefit from the systems and the government and the institutions in which has had a lot of different histories, including a lot of having done a lot of violence to Indigenous folks who are from this land. It's important for me to acknowledge that piece in this work, and it also includes the work of acknowledging that Two-Spirit people also take up space in the sports context and also identify within the LGBTQ plus spectrum, and so I'll share a little bit more on that later, but this is something that I like to invite folks to learn more about if you are unfamiliar with this. And if you are familiar with this, I encourage folks to think about how you can have what your personal relationship to this is. So for some people, it's thinking about perhaps learning the history of where you live or where you are located, and going from there. Or for some others, it's thinking about who your circle, social circle is like, and connecting more with folks who identify as who are Indigenous. So just to kind of kick us off with that. Next slide here is, I will kick it over to Vanessa to speak to Canadian Women in Sport.
Thanks, Christine, and thank you for the land acknowledgement. For anybody who just joined and didn't catch my spiel right at the beginning, my name is Vanessa. I'm with Canadian Women in Sport. My pronouns are she and her. And a little bit more about our organization. So we've been around for the last 40 years, previously known as the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport and Physical Activity. But as of February now, we just go by Canadian Women in Sport. But our mandate has stayed the same. Our mission is to create a more equitable sport system. And we do that typically at the systems level. So we work with provincial sport organizations, national and territorial sport organizations, just to make sure that we're getting that trickle down effect all the way to girls and everybody participating in sport. So that's a bit about us.
And this is a quick
plug for the new website. So now that we have a new name, we also have a new website, which is womeninsport.ca. It is way easier to find things on our website than the previous iteration. There's some really great photos we recently uploaded as well, and resources. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I would encourage you to take a moment when you're available to.
Great, thank you, Vanessa. So really quickly, for folks who are wondering who I am also as well. My name is Christine Sue. I use pronouns she, her, hers, and they, them, and their. And a little bit about me is that I've been sort of a multi-sport athlete, have played a variety of different sports, and ended up playing varsity lacrosse in my undergrad years. And since then, I've been doing a lot of both recreational community sport organizing, as well as quite a bit of policy consulting work within the sports inclusion realm. So that I come from, I also have an educator's training background, and would be working as a phys ed teacher if I had in that career path. I often work with a lot of educators and coaches as well. So that's sort of the background and the expertise that I bring in. I also identify within the LGBTQ plus community, and so that is something that I'll bring forward, and we'll be sharing a little bit more as we go through this webinar. And for folks, quick note, if you're unfamiliar with the sharing of pronouns, we will get to those pieces in this webinar, so don't worry. But just to understand, in terms of the two sets that I've shared, you're welcome to use either set or both, and that will most authentically sort of reflect and affirm the way I identify. So also, we wanted to know who's in the space and who's joining us for this webinar here. So we wanted to just quickly put out a poll here, and I will launch that poll.
So I've launched it. If you're going in there, Christine.
Thank you.
It looks like we have almost half the group, or over half of the group, having voted at this point. We'll keep it up for just a few more seconds. Get your votes in. All right. So I'll share the results. So almost half the group is made up of coaches. We also have 40% athletes present, and then some sport administrators. Thanks for participating.
So in terms of this webinar, we'll be speaking to what you can do almost immediately, really, to make sports experience more welcoming, more inclusive for folks who do identify within the LGBTQ I2S plus communities, and we'll provide you with some practical tools, hopefully to be able to just utilize within the work and the spaces you take up, whether you're an athlete or a coach or both, as well as administrators. And by the end of the webinar, we'll have some time, hopefully, for some questions. But I do recommend folks, if you do have any questions for clarification or just general questions, feel free to put that into the chat room. And Vanessa and I will be moderating that space as I go through the content. And then if there are questions that may take up more time to answer, we'll also be able to do so afterwards to follow up with emails. All right, so we will go into the next piece here, which is why this work really matters. And folks are likely, wondering, how does this relate to you? And I think a lot of this work of inclusion, and specifically in sports, is very much about minimizing harm, whether you do identify within the LGBTQI2S community or not, because the systems or the experiences and the forces that create barriers can also impact folks who do not identify within the community. And oftentimes, a lot of that is very much about feeling safe, whether you're feeling safe enough to open up to somebody, whether it's a teammate or a coach, sharing pieces of yourself that make you feel vulnerable, I think is a very important aspect to playing sports and connecting with people in sport. And so if folks aren't feeling safe, it'll be a huge deterrent for people to not want to participate and to not want to play. And so this work really is just I'd say a smaller aspect, one aspect of really understanding how we can ensure that people can really just enjoy being in the sports that they like to play, and to be connecting with everyone in the most authentic way. So to kind of get us started here, I wanted to put out a question here. As you can see, this is one version of the acronym, and I imagine that folks have likely come across different versions of the acronym. So I wanted to just kind of prompt folks to, if you can, put it into the chat what other versions of this acronym you've seen before, and I can likely perhaps clarify why there are versions. So quickly, any of the acronyms that you've seen, feel free to put that into the chat. Or if you have questions about any of these terms, either way, feel free to share. So we've got Sarah sharing LGBTQIA+. Anybody else? LGBT, yep. LGBTQIA2, yes. So to quickly kind of give you the short version, you'll definitely be seeing different acronyms, different versions of the acronym rather, and it really comes down to the context and the spaces that you're in when you do come across them. Different folks will share different letters within the acronym to ensure that they do feel seen. And so there's also a different version that is very long. And that is essentially the community wanting to use language to feel like they have a sense of belonging and that they're not alone. And if you're not sure about some of the letters, or if you're seeing a version of the acronym that you're unfamiliar with, I'd say perhaps you can put it into Google, or you can ask someone in the space to get those clarifications. But the most common one that you'll definitely see is LGBT or LGBT+. And different countries as well use different versions. But that when you do see that, that would be a more common version. But for today's sake, and with the Canadian Women in Sport, we use LGBTQI2S+ to to really communicate on some of the work that we're doing in order to, again, make sports more inclusive and more equitable. Right. Any questions so far? Feel free to put that into the chat room. And to ensure that we have you know, a bit of an understanding of how folks might be identifying within the LGBTQ plus community. We're sharing here a great tool that was created by trans students in the US, I believe, and it helps us to break it down into the different categories in which we can identify perhaps similarly or very differently. And as you can see, there are 4 categories here, which says gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, and then on the 2 bottom rows, it speaks to the attraction or sexual orientation that someone may identify or experience. So I'll quickly go over those 4 different categories here. With regards to sex assigned at birth, which is in the middle of that graphic, it is something that it's you know, when a person is brought into the world as a baby, of course, the first thing that happens is that a sex or a gender is immediately assigned to them, and oftentimes done so by a medical professional, a doula, or a midwife, and it's very much based on the anatomical characteristics of their body. So someone takes a look at the baby, most likely between their legs, and then sort of categorize them either as male or female, and then put that onto a birth certificate and have them go off into the world. Something to really note is that biologically, physically, within the body, there are other pieces that really dictate and determine how that body will continue to develop. And so it's important to understand that oftentimes there are different gonads, different reproductive systems that exist in a body, and different hormone levels that will continue to shift and change as that body develops. And a third category that is important to note is intersex. And someone who is of the intersex experience or identifies as intersex may very much mean that they don't neatly fit in the typical definitions of either male or female. And so if that word is new to you or that you're unfamiliar with it, I encourage you to look that up and learn more about what it's like being intersex going forward in terms of understanding this category. But final note on this is very much that the sex is assigned to the baby because, of course, it's a baby and the baby can't quite consent to anything just yet. As that baby grows and develops, the next category here is gender identity. They'll form a gender identity, and oftentimes that has been, the research studies have reported that a gender identity is typically formed within the ages of 3 to 6. They'll have a better understanding of what gender means to them, what they feel, and gender identity is very much of a person's most inner sense of self, their experiences of gender. And that's where you'll see a lot of different types of language that describes somebody's gender identity, but it's important to understand that it's very much like a gender universe, if you will. I think of it as the constellation, your own star. You have your own experiences of manhood, womanhood, girlhood, boyhood, or anywhere in between or outside there, those 2 categories. That's very much gender identity. It's very much based on your experience of gender and how you feel about it. Going into the next category On the graphic here, you'll see gender expression, and some of the words in there used to describe gender expression is feminine, masculine. I personally use androgynous as well to describe that. And it's really a person's way of expressing their own gender and communicating that. So whether it's through dress, the activities they get up to. So in this case, when we're thinking about sports, types of sports, play, can often deem them as more feminine or masculine. Even the tone of their voice, all those pieces very much add into how someone expresses their gender. And I think all of us do that in one way or another, whether it's conscious or not. But for a lot of LGBTQ, I2S folks, it is very conscious. Because a lot of times that's where they may end up feeling like a space may not be safe for them to express their gender in a way that is most authentic to them. Lastly, the last category is attraction or sexual orientation is probably a more common term. That's where we're thinking about the experiences or the feelings that a person can have towards other people, hence the word attraction. So as you can see in the graphic, it says physically attracted to, emotionally attracted to. So that's speaking to the how someone is attracted to someone, and there's plenty of terms that speaks to who were also attracted to someone. So that's something to note in terms of different experiences of attraction, because as you can see in the different acronyms shared in the chat, there is an A in there, and that stands for asexual. For folks who don't or experience very little physical attraction towards someone. So those are the 4 different categories. I know that I had just essentially info dumped, and I know that this may be unfamiliar for folks, so take some time to look more into these different categories, or perhaps invite you to reflect on how you yourself may identify or what types of words you might use to describe your experiences in these different categories. In terms of, just to give you a quick example, so I'm somebody, so going through the different categories here, I'm somebody who was assigned female at birth. Someone took a look between my legs when I was a baby, and they just said female, nice and easy, move forward. I was mostly raised as a girl growing up, and then later on as a woman. That's sort of how I understood my experiences, but something didn't really quite feel true for me. And so later on, I started to identify as non-binary and gender fluid, being that my experiences of gender shifts over time. And in terms of my gender expression, I have both a mix of feminine and masculine traits, and so androgynous, like I said earlier, is the term that I use. To simply put it, if you find me on a dance floor pre-COVID times, you would definitely see Justin Timberlake dance moves and Beyonce dance moves all together. So it's a fun time. So that's sort of how I describe my gender expression. And in terms of my attraction, I use plenty of words to describe how I experience my attraction towards other people, but gay and lesbian are very much terms that I use to talk about that. So that's just quickly a summary of how I use this framework to describe my experiences, and I think it can be very empowering for folks to be able to find the language to describe their own experiences and to share who they are. Just quickly note, transgender, trans, or trans are terms that you'll definitely come across in understanding gender identity, and so it's describing that category in terms of somebody who does not identify with the sex or the gender they were assigned at birth. So when that doesn't align with what is typically assumed or expected of somebody in terms of their experiences. So these are some terms here. There's a lot of umbrella terms within the community. Transgender is one of them. And as I mentioned before, as a term of non-binary, it does fall under transgender, but that it's a more specific way of talking about identifying outside of the male, female, or the man and women categories. So I'm going to pause really quickly. I know that I had just gone through quite a bit of terminology. I want to invite folks to put in any questions about specific terminology that they're unfamiliar with in the chat. And if I can answer them within this webinar, I will. But if it will take more to answer, Vanessa and I can look to share some resources to help folks to better understand what they mean.
Christine, your connection isn't very strong. It sometimes goes a little bit choppy, so we might, maybe if you turn off your camera and then we try again later on. If anybody has any questions about terminology, feel free to put them in the chat right now, and we will flag those.
What is non-binary? Great question. So we've got a question here in the chat. I can quickly answer that. So as you can see in the graphic here, what we're used to seeing and what's very much in the media and the conversations is, and specifically within sports, is that there are quite a bit of folks who may be transitioning while still competing as athletes, or folks who are coming into sports, competing at a higher level, that may identify as trans women or trans man. And there's different types of attention and language that is being used with regards to these different experiences, but that is very much within the gender binary. So what that means is acknowledging the category of men and category of women as two dominant gender categories, and to identify as non-binary, it's a way of being able to talk about having experiences that don't align or resonate with being specifically within the category of women or category of men. So hopefully that clears. Oh, sorry. Hopefully that clears up the term non-binary there. I definitely encourage folks to Google those terms as well. There's different ways to define the term non-binary, but that's sort of at large what that is speaking to. There is a lot of terms within this this category where, because there hasn't been other terms in the past that represent and reflect the experiences people have, they've had to come up with their own language. And so you'll see here genderqueer, gender fluid, demigirl, nutoi, agender, and there's plenty of other terms as well. And a note is that it's you don't have to know all of the definitions or all of the terms. It's all about recognizing that that's somebody sharing a part of themselves with you, so that you can understand they may not identify in the what is typically known as men or women gender categories. Great questions. And with regards to these different folks of different experiences and specifically within different gender categories or identities. You'll also notice, and you've noticed that Vanessa and I shared our pronouns. And so I'm gonna quickly share a video here on understanding the language and the use of pronouns and why that's important, specifically for folks who are trans or non-binary. So I will just, there we go. This is a video made by a group of youth in Australia called Minus 18. They do a lot of work in developing educational materials and making them free online. And they used to have an app for pronouns too, for folks who want to practice using gender neutral pronouns. But this is a video that you can definitely easily access on YouTube. So I'll just play this here.
Oh. Oops. Christine, is this the slide you want to be on right now?
Vanessa, perhaps for any other videos, we could just send a link in the chat and
Yeah.
they can look at it later. Yeah, that didn't work that well, unfortunately.
Okay. Christine, are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Is this the slide you wanted to be on?
Yep, that is perfect. It seems like my connection to Zoom is having some issues. Apologies, folks. So we'll continue as much as we can. Please take note if you, or message us if you need me to repeat a point. So I encourage folks to finish watching that video after this webinar. But really the main point around pronouns is that it is super important to use once somebody has shared their pronouns with you. If you don't have access to that information, just ask, but definitely don't target folks who look gender diverse only to ask those pronoun questions. See if you can incorporate this practice of asking with everybody in your space, and go from there. Other pieces around language is around the fact that these categories are separate from one another, and it's important to not make those assumptions around how somebody may be identifying. And especially within a sport setting, sometimes folks may not feel safe enough to come out, and so they would have to filter themselves and not be able to be as authentic in this space. So if we can go into the next slide here to see sort of what that looks like in a sports context. You know, this is just one example of where somebody is going through sort of that coming out process with their teammates. So say that, you know, this person is realizing that they identify differently or that their experiences are different, and perhaps they express their gender in a more sort of gender non-conforming kind of way, and that their team may be suspecting. And then eventually, you know, they feel comfortable, they shared it with some teammates and let the coach know, or it could be the experiences of where somebody finds out somehow, maybe through social media, and then eventually, you know, if the conditions are in place for them to feel safer, they may come out to the entire team and let the coach know as well. Or that they could be also out publicly, and that could take some time as well. So this is sort of just one way that somebody can go through a process of coming out, either and both or both, about their sexual and gender identity, and those experiences could differ quite differently, depending on how they self-identify. If we can go into the next slide here, we can provide some more context around specific experiences of homophobia and biphobia in sport. And a lot of these experiences are stemmed, I say, rooted in misogyny. So for women in particular, say if their gender expression may be more masculine, they may end up being you know, perceived as queer or gay, and that's sort of just one experience where perhaps like that person doesn't identify as queer or gay, but they are seen as such, and so they may also experience homophobia because of their gender expression. But also, you know, it's important to acknowledge that there is more acceptance for folks who identify as perhaps lesbian or queer, who are also women in the sports space. So that's something just to note. And that is, as you can see in the picture there, an example of an athlete who is out and who's a retired athlete. Going into the next slide here, what can be different, or how, you know, misogyny manifests in a different way, affecting folks who identify as men. Given that the social interactions may be quite different, especially if they're on, you know, gender segregated sports teams, their sexuality may be called into question if, say, their gender expression is a lot more feminine or not as masculine as expected that they should be. And so homophobia can very much manifest and come through in the ways in which that kind of gender expression may be socially punished. And this is where a lot of folks experience violence, and explicit violence. I definitely know of plenty of friends who have experienced a lot of violence in the locker room and growing up in schools and in sports teams that really ended up pushing them out of sports, not because they wanted to stop playing, but because the spaces weren't safe enough for them in order to fully participate. And so that's how, you know, misogyny can come through in a different way to punish folks, and especially for men who are more feminine presenting or express their gender in a more feminine way. Going into the next slide, with regards to experiences in Canadian sport, there's quite a bit of work about and around athlete inclusion, but it's actually quite hard for coaches to come out as well, because it's not just about their participation in sport, but also that the idea of professionalism comes into play, and that they are in positions of power. And so oftentimes folks who identify within the queer community, they may fear that a lot of stereotypical or stereotypes may be named, or assumptions may be made about their ability to coach and create safer spaces for all athletes. And so it's important to also understand how that those experiences of homophobia and biphobia, and I would even add transphobia, can manifest for coaches within the space. And so a lot of folks don't feel safe enough yet to come out, which is why we're having this conversation here in terms of understanding what it's like to be from the LGBTQ I2S community and participating in sport in the various roles that folks may take up. And in terms of transphobia, there are quite a bit, I'd say a very long list of experiences that are very different compared to people who identify as lesbian, bi, or gay, because we are talking about those different categories of identity here. With regards to folks who experience transphobia, it's very much about their gender identity and the shifts that may be happening in their journey or their career as an athlete. For trans women, so people who may be assigned male at birth and later on identify and come out as being trans women, they would be questioned a lot. There's policies that specifically limit how they can be eligible for participation, and especially for higher performance sports, that there are specifically, thinking about hormone levels, whether they've gone through medical transition. So if they have had surgeries and the types of hormones they have in their bodies, all of those different things are very much put into question and discussed in the public, in the media. And you can likely imagine how hard that might be for someone to, especially if they are competing at a higher level, for their very private information about their bodies being put out into the public. And so this is definitely a topic that we can spend more than an hour to talk about, but it's important to acknowledge that it is also quite different for trans women versus, if we go into the next slide, for trans men. And this is, again, where we can see misogyny come up in a different way, where trans men are not put into question as much when they're competing in sport, and that there are somehow certain disadvantages for people who are assigned female at birth, and that the assumption that because of that assignment, because of the specific body parts that they have, that they somehow would not be as competitive in or have advantages in their competition or participation in sport. And so this is something to note in understanding how transphobia manifests in the sporting context, and how people would use those pieces of information to decide whether they or not they come out or participate in sports at all. So those are just sort of some generalizations around these types of experiences. There has been some more research study being done. And so in the next slide here, you can see a more recent research that was done by a couple folks in the Canadian context. And just to capture some information about athletes and how they self-identify, as well as their ages as well, in especially thinking about how cultures and climates have starting to shift, where more younger youth and children may be identifying differently, or they're more able to come out because it's they feel safer, or that they have access to more language that they can use to self-identify. So in sort of breaking down some of those pieces here, here's some information about how someone expresses their sexual orientation, or rather, this is sort of adding in the piece of gender expression here, around how someone might carry themselves in the space. And so it's this is where you kind of can apply those 4 different categories of identity here, in understanding how many people actually do come out, and how many are comfortable sharing those pieces of themselves with their teammates, with their coaches, and at large. And in understanding the barriers that do exist within sport, this is a great slide here that captures the source of homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, or in short, LGBTQ plus phobia, and where that comes through in terms of the different spaces people move in and out of. So as you can see, there's social media and teammates' attitudes, so perhaps thinking about the casual conversations people have every day, and then also the type of sport that can often impact those experiences as well. So that's a lot of information, and we definitely want to now take some time to engage with you folks on the webinar. So we're going to launch a poll here, just to see, how close.
Christine, sorry to interrupt this, Ryan here. I didn't understand actually your last slide. In terms of what you're representing there.
Yeah, of course. So in terms of the information shared below, as you can see, very important, low or not at all. It's more so understanding where perhaps like homophobic, biphobic, transphobic language can show up, and whether that's important for the folks who do identify within the LGBTQ plus community, and in the different types of sport as well, in understanding those experiences, if that makes sense.
Okay, so for example, on the social media side, it majority think it comes up a lot within social media. Is that what it represents?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like, so my understanding of this was very much of, like social media being a huge part of, I'd say, a lot of youth in their lives, that that can very much impact how much they want to engage with their teammates, and participate within specific sports, and that's just one way of stating that experience there. And Vanessa, feel free to jump in here as well, if you'd like to add information about that.
Yeah, I would just say it's how do these 3 factors, so being social media, the attitudes of teammates, and the type of sport, impact how somebody, like Christine says, presents themselves or carries themselves or exists in the world. So, if you look at the 40% who say that the attitudes on social media are important to them, that either they're seeing something positive or they're seeing something negative, and that impacts how they operate and how authentically they live. The attitudes of teammates, if it's a really open environment, then people value that really highly. They say it's important or very important. You'll see that in how they live. Does that clarify, Ryan?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Awesome.
Any other questions before we move forward? All right, so we wanted to shift gears a little bit and to see, you know, how may that potentially show up in folks' circles and in the work that they do. We're going to launch 2 polls here to see where folks are at.
So for this poll, you have the option of selecting multiple, depending on your experience and your community. Okay, we'll close the poll in a few seconds. So get your votes and your submissions in, and then we'll share the results. These are anonymous polls, by the way. Christine, I know you're a co-host, so you might not be able to see the results. But we have 10% of the group responding yes to lesbian, queer, gay woman, 80% of the group responding yes to gay/queer man, 30% of the group responding yes to bisexual woman or man, 20% responding yes to transgender, 20% responding yes to gender queer, gender fluid, non-conforming, non-binary, and 10% responding yes to other.
All right, and so before we launch the next poll, I just want to note, you know, that's sounds like or looks like that this work definitely touches on people's lives in this webinar, and hopefully some of these pieces of information so far has helped clarify or potentially connect the poll. Context. What are some of the experiences that may be present? So again, you can pick multiple options here.
All right, almost everyone's voted. We'll keep it open for a few more seconds, and then we'll share the results. All right, a lot more similar reporting across the board. So 60% report yes to having a teammate who currently or has identified as lesbian, queer, or gay woman, 70% as gay or queer man, 50% bisexual woman or man, 30% transgender, and 30% reporting yes for genderqueer, gender fluid, non-conforming, or non-binary.
Wonderful. So thank you all so much for participating in those polls. I think it's important to then recognize that, you know, a lot more folks, again, are actually participating in sport, and that these experiences are likely present within the circles that folks are moving in and out of. I wanted to recognize that or acknowledge that there is a question put in the chat here by Helen. How do transitioning hormones affect energy level and athletic performance? That is a really great question. And a question that will elicit a longer answer, to which, as you can see on the slide here, one of the documents can definitely speak to that question, which is the, or rather the organization and then the affiliated documents that they have provided can answer that question. So these are some of the resources available, not all, of course, but that can be very helpful to further your learning and to support any sort of advocacy work or any policy changes that you may want to be making in your spaces. And so one in particular in the center there for creating inclusive environments for trans participants in Canadian sport. There is a policy template that folks can use if you don't have an existing policy that speaks to specifically gender expansive inclusion practices. So thinking about trans folks, thinking about non-binary folks. They also have a document that is a little bit older from 2012 that specifically breaks down a lot of different pieces of information about people who identify as trans, and specifically trans men and trans women. And that's definitely where you can find out some of the answers with regarding Helen's question here. So I encourage folks to take a look at these documents later. There are also quite a bit of organizations that do specific work on these topics here. So you can play one team to highlight. I'm also part of a sports inclusion task force that is constantly having conversations about how to push this work forward. A quick plug about that, we have an event coming up that is more of a Zoom meeting to talk about where we can take this work forward. And Marnie McBean will be speaking as well to kind of relaunch the group and the ways in which we'll be supporting the work of sports inclusion. And so welcome folks to learn more about all of these different organizations and how you can look into perhaps getting involved as well, if you'd like. So to wrap up some of the key takeaway points here is it's really important to be taking action towards making the sporting space safer, and one of which is that you can do some more research, learn more about the folks in your space, if they're willing and able to share about their experiences of being within the LGBTQI2S communities. But you can also do research, go on YouTube. There are plenty of people sharing about their experiences, what is like for trans people, what all of the different terms may mean. And so I highly welcome folks to do a little bit of that research if you're interested into learning more. There are also other actions that you can take in around using pronouns, as I have mentioned earlier, and also practice using gender neutral pronouns. and to ensure that if someone does come out to you as trans and they change the pronouns that they were previously using, it's important to practice that so that you can avoid making those mistakes. Okay. Continuing, just a quick note, if you ever come across any resistance around people saying, oh, this work is done, we're all good, this is a great website that continues to update to note how often homophobic, transphobic language is, mostly homophobic language is used on social media. So that's one way to raise awareness. And there are different ways in which you can learn more about allyship. So for someone who is an ally or practicing allyship, it may mean that you don't identify as queer or within the LGBTQI2S community, but that you want to support folks who are within the community. So this is one example of a person talking about allyship. There are plenty more resources even now too that you can learn about allyship and how that applies to more than just gender and gender expansive and sexual identity issues and topics. It's important not to speak over or speak for people, but to amplify voices as much as you can, and to really listen if you're unfamiliar with the work or with the information you're being presented. And it's important to note quickly that it is for effective allyship to happen, signaling, communicating that you're making the effort to learn and to stand up to stop harm is very much something that you can do. So these are examples of where you can communicate that in a space. And it's important to ensure that you're holding yourself accountable if you do put up these signs or communicate these pieces to people so that people can feel safer going into that space. You can also do plenty of things here in terms of engaging with You Can Play. So this is an example of where an organization decided to partner with You Can Play and make a video pledging to the idea of inclusion in sport and how and sort of affirming folks that, you know, anyone can play in the sport regardless of how they identify. So that's something that, you know, as a team, you can definitely look into doing if you'd like to take action in that way. These are just some more examples of folks who are often partners in this effort moving towards a more inclusive sport system and institution. The Canadian Olympic Committee and You Can Play have most certainly partnered and also participated in pride parades in the past to signal, you know, this is a really important value for athletes and sport folks. So to take action for you, perhaps more immediately, I think some of these questions are really great to think about. So what more can I or can we be doing to support LGBTQI2S plus inclusion as a member of Canoe Kayak Ontario, or perhaps if you're from a different sport organization? It's really important to ask that question, to think about that, and keep that practice of allyship on as an ongoing, continuous practice. And so some of these other questions could also come up. You know, what if anything limits us from doing so? And then another question is, what's one thing that you can do and commit to doing right now? You're welcome to submit that in the chat if you'd like, but that essentially wraps things up for the webinar today. And I like to kind of push for ongoing learning as a way to engage with Pride Month festivities. And thank you very much for all the folks who came on to the webinar, and apologies again around the connection issues that we had, but thank you very much for having us here, and thank you to Canoe Kayak for hosting this webinar.
Yeah, hi everyone. I, echo what Christine said. Thank you so much for joining us today and engaging with us. For those of you who submitted questions or responses, that was really fantastic. Big thank you to Canoe Kayak for having us on here today and for bearing with us through some of these technical difficulties. You can reach Christine or I through Canadian Women in Sport if you have any follow-up questions, and we will be sure to share our contact as well as evaluations to understand your experience, so we can ensure that we improve with each virtual delivery. But yeah, once again, thank you so much. Thank you, Christine, for your time and effort today. It's really appreciated. And yeah, Christine, did you have any final thoughts?
No, I will be just sharing some a resource here in the chat, but I believe we'll also be following up with some more resources. But yeah, very appreciative of this platform here today. Happy to answer more questions. I'm sure we'll be able to share our email addresses as well in a follow-up email.
Yeah, all of the resources referenced, including videos and websites, will be in our follow-up information. And if you have any questions, you can reach us through Ryan. Thank you so much, Ryan, and everybody from the Canoe Kayak team.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Christine and Vanessa. So yeah, just echoing what Vanessa said, if there is questions, I think probably the easiest process is if you're comfortable sending through me, and then I can forward on, or you can reach the Canadian Women in Sport directly if that's more appropriate. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a great day. It's beautiful here in Toronto, and I hear it's pretty nice in Ottawa too. So I hope you're out paddling and enjoying it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.